Since I've been here, I've talked about architectural use of design, I've talked about sculpture, I've talked about new architecture, I've talked about tectonics, and I've also talked about typology. Some of you may have heard those lectures before. Now we're going to be talking, and you had to listen to English, so this afternoon you're very lucky because we have two distinguished colleagues who speak very good Indonesian. But unfortunately, I'm not one of them. When we consider the idea of typology, it's an old idea that has been in existence for almost 100 years. Sometimes it's popular, sometimes it's not. My argument is that it's essential. So when we talk about the uses of typology today, one of the important ways that we can do it is to address one of the most important problems of our time around the world, and that is how to build a city. And that's what I would like to talk about. Ideas about building a city. 80 years ago, one man envisioned the future. In 1922, Le Corbusier explored the idea of a city for 3 million people. That was probably a big city at the time. Jakarta now has 15 million people. When we look at this image, we are impressed by its power, by its novelty, by its scale. When you look closely at the city, you ask yourself, where do I fit in? What do I do down here? That's the question I think is missing from urban design, from that drawing on to today. We need to find ways to think about making the city that will allow buildings and the public space to be organized in ways that are human. Le Corbusier was intent on inventing a new city. Is that necessary? Of course it's necessary. So much change is upon us. But how do we go about doing that? My argument will be today is that we have to learn from the past to create a foundation for the future. What is that path that we need to learn? Will it be the past that Le Corbusier invented for the future? Or will it be closer to the past that every human being who lived in cities contributed to making the city of history, the city of the future? Of course, this was the city of the future. Today, some cities is the city of the present. And what do we think about that? In the city of St. Louis, where I teach, in 1955, the firm of Helmut Yamasaki and Weinweber built a housing project that followed the principles of Le Corbusier's Radiant City in combination with Walter Gropius's ideas for high-density housing for workers. Within 20 years, the people who were asked to move in moved out, and it was empty. In 1975, it was blown up. The future failed. Not all the things from the past have failed. With the Mescaz project or the Williamsburg houses in New York still exist today. And I'll talk about that later and how with the question of what is its contribution to the city. How do we understand the relationship between building and city? A building is a consequence of concrete construction or something that will last for a period of time. It's unlikely that buildings will change significantly. Cities, on the other hand, change all the time. Every new building makes a new part of the city. We have old cities today, like Ahmedabad, which have grown from ancient times and still exist in the same patterns that they had before. Or we have cities like Walnut Creek in the United States. I don't know where Walnut Creek is, but I know it's everywhere. This pattern of residential living exists everywhere. Notice the difference between this and Ahmedabad. It's the same scale. Let's go back to Ahmedabad. The drawings I'm showing you were done by Alan Jacobs, a very distinguished professor of urban design from the University of California at Berkeley. And what he did for the last 20 years is to map cities to the same scale so that we can understand the relationship between built form, public space, and the pattern of the city. Notice that in Ahmedabad, all the streets are dead ends. Along those streets, we know there are hundreds of houses. In this suburban stereotype in the United States, all the streets are sort of dead-ended, but there might be only one house there, one house there, one house there, one house there, one house there. Almost no density. Ahmedabad is full density. Which one do we want to live in? Well, for some people, the answer is either. A city in the United States that is very old by American standards. People came from Europe and England, settled this area, using patterns that they had used, that they were familiar with, and then imposing more formal ideas at other points in time. A city of a variety of patterns, but always maintaining scale. The challenge for Boston, I think, is that its intimate small scale over time was lost. And the part of Boston now that exists on the place where the original settlers first came has changed dramatically. This map doesn't show it very well, so I'll show you another map. This indicates the density of the dwellings that occurred in 1922. In the following 60 years, that pattern became this. What is this stuff? What is that? Is it a street? Is it a garden? Is it a square? The fact that we don't really know what that is leaves us with a question of the relationship between urban morphology and building typology. And that question to me is the nature of the street. What is the street like? In Barcelona, Cerdà gives us one example of how a city can be built around a pattern of streets, and that the buildings are an integral part of the making of that pattern. In Brasilia, we have no idea of what the street is. And for those of you who will be lucky enough to go to Brasilia someday, you will realize that it's not a city. It's a group of monuments. New York has a colonial old part and a modern new part. The modern new part works because it's a pattern, and it works because it limits the size of buildings. No building in New York is bigger in footprint than a New York block. It is defense against the supermall. Paris is a medieval city. And yet, even though Haussmann ripped it apart, the medieval portion was able to survive. The big house in Boulevards kept it, modernized it without killing it. Other patterns for cities, a new city like Portland, Oregon, not an old city at all, chooses its pattern for development on very small blocks, only about 60 meters square.